Welcome, guys. Something very unusual is happening inside Disney and ABC right now, and it's not just another corporate restructuring story. Behind the official statements, press releases, and carefully worded explanations, a much deeper internal crisis appears to be unfolding inside one of the most powerful entertainment empires in the world. Hundreds of employees have reportedly been laid off. Major ABC programs are feeling the impact, and instead of calming the situation, Disney's leadership now seems to be stepping directly into public confrontation, aggressively responding to critics, defending decisions, and trying to control a narrative that is rapidly slipping out of their hands. But here's where things get even more interesting, because the official explanation from Disney leadership and the interpretation coming from critics are not just slightly different, they are almost completely opposite versions of reality. One side calls it strategic optimization. The other side calls it damage control for declining performance. So what is actually going on inside Disney right now? Is this a smart restructuring of a modern media giant adapting to a changing industry? Or is it a sign that the pressure inside ABC has finally reached a breaking point? And why is Disney's leadership suddenly so defensive about public criticism? Stay with this video until the end, because the deeper we go, the more complicated this situation becomes. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe, because on this channel, we break down the stories Hollywood doesn't fully explain out loud. For the past several weeks, Disney and its major broadcasting division, ABC, have been facing what can only be described as one of the most unstable internal periods in recent memory. On the surface, the situation is being described as routine restructuring, a necessary step in a rapidly evolving media environment. But behind that carefully controlled corporate language, a much more intense transformation appears to be taking place inside the company. Reports indicate that Disney CEO Josh D'Amaro has overseen significant layoffs impacting hundreds of employees associated with ABC operations. And this is not happening in isolation. The ripple effects of these decisions are reportedly being felt across multiple flagship programs that have defined ABC's identity for years. Shows such as Jimmy Kimmel Live, The View, and Good Morning America are now part of a much larger conversation about the future direction of the network itself. Because when layoffs begin affecting core programming infrastructure, it is no longer just a cost-cutting measure, it becomes a structural shift in how the network operates. And naturally, this raises a critical question: what is actually forcing Disney to make these decisions at this scale? According to official messaging from Disney leadership, the answer is relatively straightforward. They argue that the company is focusing on efficiency, long-term sustainability, and a leaner operational model for ABC. In their framing, this is not about failure, it is about adaptation. They emphasize that the media landscape has changed dramatically, and legacy television networks must evolve in order to remain competitive in a world dominated by streaming platforms, digital-first content, and fragmented audience attention. However, critics of the company present a very different interpretation. From their perspective, these layoffs are not happening in a vacuum. They point to declining ratings across several ABC programs, inconsistent audience retention, and increasing difficulty in maintaining relevance in late-night and daytime television formats. In this interpretation, the restructuring is not purely strategic, it is reactive, especially when long-running programs like Jimmy Kimmel Live are frequently discussed in relation to fluctuating viewership patterns. While the show still maintains a strong brand presence, critics argue that its ratings performance has become increasingly unstable over time, with occasional spikes followed by noticeable drops in audience engagement. Similarly, The View has often been at the center of cultural and political debate, which some analysts believe contributes to audience polarization rather than broad appeal. And in a traditional advertising-driven television model, polarization can sometimes translate into unpredictability, and unpredictability is something advertisers tend to avoid. This is where the narrative begins to split even further. Because while critics focus heavily on ratings and revenue concerns, Disney leadership is firmly rejecting the idea that financial decline is the primary driver behind these decisions. In fact, Josh D'Amaro has taken a notably more direct and confrontational public stance than what is typically expected from a Disney executive. Instead of staying within carefully controlled corporate statements, Josh D'Amaro has recently taken a noticeably more direct and public-facing approach when responding to criticism surrounding Disney and ABC. Traditionally, Disney leadership has maintained a very polished and distance-based communication style, relying heavily on official press releases, carefully worded investor statements, and controlled media messaging. But in this situation, that traditional barrier appears to be weakening. D'Amaro has actively responded to public criticism, pushing back against claims that the recent layoffs are tied to declining ratings, political positioning, or ideological influence within ABC programming. His core message remains consistent and extremely firm. Disney is not being driven by politics, controversy, or external cultural pressure. Instead, the company insists that these decisions are rooted entirely in internal business strategy, operational restructuring, and long-term planning designed to stabilize the future of ABC. He has also strongly rejected the growing narrative circulating online and in media discussions that Disney is reacting to what some describe as political backlash or cultural criticism. According to his statements, a significant portion of the criticism directed toward Disney is either based on misinformation or shaped by politically motivated interpretations of corporate restructuring decisions that have little to do with the actual internal reasoning. In addition to that, he has specifically addressed the language being used in public discourse, especially terms like woke agenda or DEI agenda. DeMauro argues that these labels are overly simplified and do not accurately represent the complexity of Disney's internal business strategies. In his view, these terms reduce a large-scale corporate restructuring effort into a cultural talking point, which he believes misrepresents the reality of what the company is trying to achieve. However, this is exactly where the situation becomes more controversial, because critics argue that when a major corporation repeatedly denies external pressure or cultural influence while simultaneously undergoing large-scale restructuring, layoffs, and operational downsizing, it naturally creates a perception gap that becomes extremely difficult to ignore. And in the modern media environment, perception is not just important, it is often as powerful as financial reality itself. Disney, in particular, is not just a content production company, it is a global narrative-driven brand that has built its entire identity around storytelling, emotional engagement, and cultural influence across generations. So when leadership messaging begins to appear defensive, reactive, or unusually vocal, it no longer stays limited to internal corporate communication. It immediately becomes part of the public narrative ecosystem surrounding the company. Some industry analysts even suggest that Disney's current communication style reflects a broader shift in how the company is responding to criticism. Instead of maintaining strict corporate silence or indirect messaging, leadership now appears more willing to engage directly with public discourse, respond to narratives, and challenge criticism head-on. But while that approach may seem more transparent on the surface, it also introduces a new layer of risk. Because the more a corporation engages directly with public criticism, the more it opens itself up to continuous scrutiny, interpretation, and counterinterpretation. And in Disney's case, that scrutiny is already extremely intense due to multiple overlapping pressures affecting the entire media industry at the same time. These pressures include rapidly changing television consumption habits, where traditional broadcast audiences are steadily shrinking. They also include the explosive growth of streaming platforms, which has completely reshaped how audiences consume entertainment content, reducing the dominance of legacy networks like ABC. On top of that, there is increasing instability in the advertising market, where brands are more selective and performance-driven in their spending decisions, making traditional TV revenue less predictable than before. And finally, there is ongoing internal restructuring across multiple Disney divisions, which signals that these changes are not isolated to ABC alone, but part of a much broader organizational realignment. When all of these factors combine, they create an environment where even standard business decisions are no longer viewed in isolation. Instead, they are interpreted through a much larger lens of corporate strength, stability, and long-term viability. And that is exactly what is happening with the ABC layoffs right now. Supporters of Disney's strategy argue that what the company is doing is not unusual, but rather necessary. From their perspective, this restructuring is simply a natural evolution for a legacy media company trying to survive in today's digital-first entertainment world. They argue that trimming operations, cutting costs, and shifting resources towards stronger performing segments are necessary steps to keep the business competitive and sustainable long-term. However, critics see a very different picture. They suggest that the scale and consistency of these changes point to something deeper than normal restructuring, possibly a structural decline in traditional broadcast television's influence and relevance. In their view, this isn't just modernization, but a sign of growing challenges facing networks like ABC in maintaining audience engagement in a rapidly changing media landscape. And this is where the debate splits sharply. On one side, it's seen as smart adaptation and survival strategy. On the other, it raises concerns about instability, weakening trust, and shrinking cultural impact of traditional TV formats. At the center of this entire discussion is Josh D'Amaro, now acting as both the architect of Disney's restructuring and the public face of its backlash. His communication style and public statements are being analyzed almost as closely as the company's financial and ratings performance. Because in moments like these, leadership messaging is no longer just explanation. It becomes a key part of shaping public perception itself. And how Disney manages this narrative in the coming months will heavily influence whether it is seen as successfully evolving or slowly losing ground in a changing media world. And that's the situation unfolding inside Disney and ABC right now, a mix of restructuring, backlash, and shifting narratives that's still developing in real time. Whether this turns out to be smart adaptation or a deeper industry problem is something only time will answer. If you want more breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.